Heat waves, drought, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, blizzards, bitter cold. Extreme weather has an incredible impact on people across the globe. On Mount Washington, our scientists brave some of the worst weather on the planet to improve our understanding of our warming world. All right, good evening and welcome everyone to Mount Washington Observatory's Science in the Mountains lecture series with program support from MathWorks. My name is Brian Fitzgerald and I'm the Director of Science and Education here at Mount Washington Observatory, and joining us this evening to discuss interpreting risk and weather in the backcountry are author and risk professional Ty Gagne and Mount Washington Observatory weather observer and staff meteorologist Ryan Knapp. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's program. For those of you who aren't already familiar, Mount Washington Observatory is a private, nonprofit, member-supported organization whose mission is to advance the understanding of the forces that create Earth's weather and climate. And we accomplish that a few different ways through operating our Summit Weather Station with around-the-clock weather observation and forecasting, by conducting research and product testing projects, and by developing and offering innovative educational programs. If you have some questions for tonight's speakers and are joining via Zoom, please use the Q&A button that you can find right at the bottom center of your toolbar. We'll make sure we have some time at the end of the program for a live Q&A session, and be sure to get your questions in as they come up, so feel free to get them in there. If you're joining us on the live stream on Facebook, welcome. Thanks so much for being with us as well. While we won't be able to respond to your questions directly in real time, we will follow up after the program. Our Summit staff will try and respond as quickly as they can following. If you'd like to connect through Zoom for the next program, please be sure to register using the program link on mountwashington.org/SITM. All righty, so let's get into things. Thanks again, everyone, for joining this evening. Before we kick things off, I am going to launch a poll for all of you this evening joining on Zoom. So you should see a poll showing up in your Zoom window. Go ahead and respond. I'll give you about a minute or so to do that. A few questions for you this evening. Curious, where are you joining us from? Perhaps somewhere within the great region of New England. Perhaps you're outside of New England. Perhaps you're outside the USA. Welcome. Another question for you. Have you participated previously, or are you planning to participate this year in the Observatory's Seek the Peak event? Curious to see how many of you have joined before and how many of you might be curious about the event as well. So certainly lots of great info available there for the Observatory's most important fundraiser of the year. A couple trivia questions for you. What is the 11th essential for camping and hiking? Perhaps you've heard the 10 essentials. Tonight, we're going to talk about a very important and critical sort of 11th essential, if you will. Is it self-awareness, water or food, map and compass? How about lots of style? Maybe lots of neon clothing out there. Any of those responses are acceptable, I suppose. Choose your best option. And then lastly, what percentage of time does the summit of Mount Washington spend in the fog each year? 40, 45, 60%, 80%? Get your guesses in there and we'll see where the winners lie. And got quite a few of you responding this evening. That's great. I'll give you just another 5 seconds or so to get your responses in, and we'll end the polling there. And we'll get ourselves going. All right, 3, 2, 1, and we'll end it right there. And let's see what we have for some results. All right, so for those of you joining on Zoom, you should see some of those results there. New Hampshire represented awfully well, about 38% of our participants joining from New Hampshire. Massachusetts, a close second, followed by outside New England, and then quite a few Mainers and Nutmeggers as well from the great state of Connecticut. Thanks so much for joining. Oh, even 5 of you from outside the country. Wonderful. All right, so have you participated previously, or will you participate in this year's Seek the Peak event? Unfortunately, it looks like the majority have said no, but that's also a wonderful opportunity for those of you who are curious about Seek the Peak. It is our annual fundraiser here at the Observatory. Pretty excited about what's going on this year. Traditionally, it's been a hike-a-thon, but this year on July 16th and 17th, it is expanding to a full adventure expo. Join the fundraising and also the opportunity to get outside and connect through a variety of different activities this year, including at our Outdoor Adventure Expo at the base of the Mount Washington Auto Road, July 17th for that date. For more information about Seek the Peak, you can go to seekthepeak.org for those of you who are curious. And then let's get to that trivia. What's the 11th essential? Most of you said self-awareness. All right, lots of self-awareness and lots of style came in second. That would have been my pick there, I think, if I didn't know the answer here. And then lastly, what percentage of time does the summit of Mount Washington spend in the fog each year? Most of you said 60%, and we will see about that in just a little bit. All right, so let me get out of the way here and stop sharing the results, and let's get right to our speakers for this evening. Alrighty, so at this time, I'd love to welcome our first speaker for tonight, Ty Gagne. Ty, are you there? Looks like you got your mic on and camera
Hey,
on, and
Brian.
can you hear me? I can hear you just fine.
I can.
Excellent. Well, Ty, why don't you take it away?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Brian, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here, and it's such a pleasure to be presenting along with Ryan Knapp tonight. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of staff members from the Mount Washington Observatory throughout my various writing projects, and I'm just so impressed with how committed they are, how hard they work, not only on climate and weather, but also in trying to provide information to the outdoor recreation community. And a lot of that is through the Higher Summits forecast. And so to have the opportunity to present with this team tonight and to work with Ryan it's just great. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So we're going to be talking about a couple of things tonight. Not only are we going to be talking about weather science, which Ryan's going to cover with all of the expertise he's going to bring to that topic, we're also going to talk about decision science. And the idea here is not to approach the mountains in a clinical way or to take away from the beauty, or connecting with nature or anything like that. Really what I'm going to be talking about, and what Ryan's going to be talking about as well, is how to widen the safety margin. How can we take that Higher Summits forecast and integrate it into our planning? And what are some of the pitfalls that go along with the planning process? And then when we're underway, when we're engaged in this thing we're very passionate about, which is getting out into the backcountry, getting out into the mountains. And one of the ways that we can really widen that safety margin is through situational awareness. You heard the term self-awareness used in the poll. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But in terms of as we are putting our plan together, and then when we are initiating that plan, regardless of what we're doing, whether we're hiking, skiing, driving a car, it doesn't really matter. This is a really important component to keeping that safety margin as wide as we possibly can. So I'm going to review the components of situational awareness. There are three. The first one is, what are the critical factors in the system? If you think about where you are right now as you're streaming in tonight, you're part of a system. Okay, it's what surrounds us. It's what we may be moving toward or moving into. And really the best way to, or the easiest way to describe this is to break it down into three components. And you're going to see this a slide from now, but it's human factors, physical factors, and environmental factors. And we're going to cover all of those tonight. The second component is, what do the factors mean when integrated with my goals? So we have these human factors. We have the physical factors. In the mountains, it's gear, it's terrain, and those kinds of things. Environmental factors, obviously it's the weather and how it's interacting with us and the terrain around us. And what does that mean in relation to the goals that we've set? As those factors change, as we change, as the weather changes, as the terrain changes, what does that mean in relation to what I have set out to do? And am I willing or able to make modifications or adapt my plan as those critical factors change throughout the course of the day or evening or whatever it is, again, we're engaged in. And then lastly, what do the factors mean over time? So we're present right now. We have awareness in terms of what's going on in the present, how we're feeling, how our team is performing, or the individual that we're with, what we're headed into, what the terrain is like right now, what the weather's doing. But what does that all mean the longer I'm out here in this system? So again, this isn't to take a clinical view. This is just to try to implement some strategies toward making this outing as safe as it can possibly be, so you can reap all of the benefits that the backcountry has to offer us, particularly right now in the situation that we find ourselves in. So now let's take these critical factors and put it into our matrix, our situational awareness matrix. So here we have our goals. So right at the outset, we're going to identify what that goal is. And I'm going to kind of approach this from a high level, because a little bit later on, Ryan and I are going to give you a specific scenario, and we're going to walk through all of this with you. But we identify the goal. Maybe it's our itinerary, the route we're going to take, the mountain we want to climb. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a mountain. Insert whatever that goal or objective is in this area, and there it is, because this applies not only to the backcountry, but to our day-to-day activities. Then we're going to assign a value to this, and we'll discuss that. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we can really set ourselves up for trouble when we assign a high value to that activity that we're potentially or planning to undertake. And again, we'll talk about that in a little while. The next one are those human factors. Okay, so we have our goal, the first component, human, and then we'll talk about physical and environmental. So we're looking at self in real time. Am I focusing on self-care? Am I feeling tired? Am I still feeling energetic? And then we're going to apply time to that. Remember, what does this all mean when we apply time to it? And so I'm feeling good now. What does that mean an hour from now when I'm in steeper terrain or more difficult situation? Then we think about the partner, okay, the person that we're with, or the group. So we're paying attention to self. We're paying attention to the individual that we might be with, or the larger group, and we're looking for opportunities to assess the performance of the group, to assess the status of the folks that we're with and how they're performing. And then we're going to apply that out into the future a little bit and say, okay, here's where this group is at now that I'm part of. What does that mean the later into the day that we go, the higher up the mountain we climb, or whatever it is that we're doing? The next one is physical factors. So this is, again, real time, and you can't see projected over here. I'll minimize this a little bit. But again, it's where am I now? And then what do I have left in my itinerary? What's ahead of me? And the fact that I still have to get back if that's what I'm planning to do. So how is time impacting? What do I have for food and hydration? Again, present moment. Am I going to have enough the later this goes on? And as the weather comes into play and I potentially start consuming more, or that fluid and food might be at risk, what does that all mean? Am I thinking about it? Am I engaging in conversation with my partner or with the group that I'm with? What is my clothing status in terms of right now? How am I feeling? And what is the condition of that clothing? Have I already saturated it because of the exertion I put in? And as the day goes on, again, projecting out, and I have to start thinking about layering clothing. And as I approach tree line and break tree line, do I have the right equipment? And then where are my bailout locations? Where am I in relation to them right now? And where are they the further along into this route that I go? So again, it's just maintaining awareness about where I am, how I'm performing, and how those physical attributes of terrain and gear and fluid and food all relate to this thing that I have set out to do. And then lastly is environmental factors. And this is where the weather comes in real time, what it's doing right now. And then what does that mean projected and how does the forecast play into that based on my interpretation of it, that I hopefully have pulled off of the web, um, from the Mount Washington Observatory. So now I'm going to transition this over to Ryan, who's going to walk you through this a little bit more. And we'll go into greater detail as to how the Higher Summits forecast is created. Ryan.
Alrighty, thank you, Ty. So let me just pull up my screen real quick here. Howdy, everyone. My name is Ryan Knapp. I'm staff meteorologist up at the Mount Washington Observatory, and I've been working there for about 15 years now. So I started back in 2005, and in that time, I've been the night meteorologist primarily, which means you might have seen my name coming up in some of the Higher Summits forecast over my time span working here. But real briefly, we'll talk about the history of our forecast. Oops, sorry there. So it started back in the 60s and 70s. I wasn't able to pin down an exact date, but it started back around that era and started as a morning hut call to all the various AMC and RMC huts in the region. So that radio call actually even continues to today. And in that forecast, we were pretty much giving them an idea of what to provide people that might have been staying over at those huts as to what to expect in the higher terrain. Then in the mid 90s, we started a website, mountwashington.org, and we started to put up a forecast on that website. Now, back in the mid 90s to mid aughts, we were only providing a synopsis as well as a 12-hour forecast. And that was only updated once a day in the morning. And it was primarily focused on that specific day. So it didn't really carry over into the overnight hours per se. Sometimes the synopsis did. And the synopsis itself, which is a fancy word for forecast discussion, was primarily discussing just that 12-hour window. Sometimes it would go a little bit further, but it just kind of varied on who was up at any particular time. Additionally, the synopsis was primarily looking at the regions. So it was kind of pulling from the National Weather Service or TV forecast at the time, because there wasn't really much availability as far as weather models go, or anything like that, because you got to remember back in the mid 90s and early aughts, the internet was not nearly as fast as it once or is currently. So there wasn't much information to pull from, and there wasn't much information to provide. But then from the mid aughts to the mid teens, we started to provide that forecast discussion as well as a 36-hour forecast. And that went out in 12-hour chunks. And at that time, it was only updated once a day. So it was in the morning. So the 36-hour window was looking at that day, that overnight hour, and then the following day. As technology evolved and allowed forecast models to improve, as well as for us to look a little bit more ahead with more confidence and verification, we then started to provide, again, the forecast discussion as well as a 48-hour forecast. So we were going out a little bit further in time. And as models and technology improves, odds are further along, we'll probably improve that a little bit longer as technology and all that does improve. But now that we are updating 48 hours out, we are also updating it twice a day. So we're also doing a morning forecast as well as a 48-hour afternoon forecast. So you can kind of slide those along and catch it at different parts of the day to get two different forecasts at any particular day. Now, in case you are not familiar with our forecast page, you can get to it by typing into your browser www.mountwashington.org/forecast. Now, in case you don't remember that, the key is just that mountwashington.org. That will bring you to our main page. And then from there should be links on the lower right-hand side that you can get to our forecast, as well as drop-down menus at the top that you can get to our forecast page as well. Now, we typically strive to get it up by 5 a.m. and 5 p.m., although there are environmental factors. So if our internet goes out, we might not be able to get that forecast up, particularly at 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. on the dot, but we always strive to get it around that time. And again, that's in Eastern time, and that's where most of our users are going to be pulling that from, is in the East Coast. So while you are on that forecast page, there's two different options. So there's both the written, and we also do an audio format. So on the very bottom of our forecast page, you can actually click on either morning or afternoon to get the entire forecast read to you if you prefer that type of formatting. It's mostly focused on Mount Washington. However, it also extends to the 5,000 footers. So Clay, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Lafayette, and a few of the other high points around the White Mountains. So you can kind of use Mount Washington as the worst case scenario, but if you're in those 5,000 foot elevation areas, odds are you're going to be experiencing something similar or maybe just slightly better or worse, depending on what the conditions are on those 5,000 footers. But you can kind of look at that. Now, later on, I'll kind of talk about how you can loosely interpolate some of that data down to the 4,000 footers and kind of use that as a base reference as well. Now, all of our forecasts consist of that forecast discussion as well as 12-hour blocks for the time periods that you might be interested in. So I know this is kind of small, but this is kind of an outline of the entire forecast page. So you'll see on the very top, you have the synopsis, the 12-hour blocks, and then the audio on the bottom. The first thing we're going to be discussing is the forecast synopsis. So this is from my coworker, David, who works the shift opposite of me. He did the morning forecast on Friday. So just putting this up there to kind of give you an idea of what that might look like. Now, the synopsis is usually about a paragraph in length. However, that will vary based on the conditions that are occurring. So if we have a lot of things that are occurring, it could be 2, maybe 3 paragraphs long. But if there isn't much going on, so let's say we have a giant ridge of high pressure that's just going to provide fair weather skies over that 48-hour period, we're not going to be discussing things that don't need to be discussed, basically. So we're putting the essentials that it's going to be nice weather for the next 48 hours. It'll be a little bit more detailed than that, but you get the idea. But in that forecast discussion, we're going to be putting in where the lows and highs are, frontal movements that might be occurring, the duration that those fronts and lows and highs are going to be affecting our particular forecast area, the timing of events. So, if it's going to look like the front is going to be moving through in the morning or during the evening hours, or if that low pressure is going to be moving rapidly out of the area and there's going to be a steep pressure gradient that might drive the winds a little bit faster. We might discuss those. Some noteworthy changes. So if, we're expecting snow in the morning and then as temperatures rise, we might see rain in the afternoon. That's where we're going to be discussing some of the timing of the events a little bit more in detail, and uncertainties where, some forecast models are saying we might see more snow or less snow, and kind of putting in those different type of quirks that you might not get out of those 12-hour windows, and kind of more laying it out as to what is causing the weather, what will be the more specifics of the weather. So you can kind of look at those 12-hour windows kind of like a footnote, as well as the synopsis being the full book that you're kind of reading. In addition, we might mention some watches, warnings, or advisories that the National Weather Service is mentioning for trailheads in the valleys below, or if any of those extend up to the higher terrain, mentioning those as well. We are operating separately from the National Weather Service. However, their watches, warnings, and advisories trump ours on any given day. So we're not going to be issuing our own. We're going to pull from whatever they're issuing. And then if there are any elevated risks, like let's say we have a particularly strong front moving through and there might be thunderstorms associated with it, that's where we're going to be mentioning those kind of events. Now, the two forecasts that we put out are morning and afternoon. So as I mentioned, the morning one will be today, tonight, tomorrow, and tomorrow night. And then in the afternoon, when we update, it'll be the overnight hours, tomorrow night, and then the day after. Now, year round, our forecasts are going to be covering 5 primary things. So it's going to be fog, clouds overhead or below the summit, precipitation and or thunderstorms that might be occurring, temperature, as well as winds. During the winter months, we actually add 2 different fields, which would be snowfall and ice, and then also wind chills. The primary reason why we mention those snowfall and ice accretion is so that way people know how much snow or ice they might be encountering and might have to prepare for as they're coming up. And wind chills is just to better know what kind of gear or layers to pack with them on any particular day. So starting off with the language, so we start with fog, and we're in the summit, or the summit is in the fog over 60% of the year. So far more often we're going to be in the clouds than we are going to be in the clear. So we always want to put a quantity of fog cover that we're expecting on the higher terrain. So there are 2 kind of extremes. So either in the clear or in the fog. So if we're in the clear, that means the entire 12-hour block that we're forecasting for is going to be completely fog free. And if we're in the fog, that means the entire 12-hour block is going to be in the fog. Now, typically our 12-hour blocks run from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. However, we might make a little bit of adjustments to those. So if we're putting out the forecast at 5 and we're already in the clouds, it's not expected typically to be moving miraculously in the next 2 hours to in the clear. So it can be extended a little bit in and out of that 12-hour window, but typically that's the time span we're looking for. Now, the three in the middle are periods of fog that might be covering the summit majority of the time or minority of the time, or we might be going in and out. And in and out can be anything from intermittent fogs. So, 1 minute it's clear, the next minute it's foggy, or that could also mean that, we're starting in the clear, moving into the fog for 3 to 6 hours during the middle of the day, and then trending towards clearing at the end of the day. And that's where reading these quantities as well as the synopsis might be going hand in hand to give you a better picture. Now, after we move on from fog, we move up in the atmosphere and talk about the cloud cover overhead. Now, if we're in the fog, we don't typically mention this because if you're in the fog, you're not going to typically see the clouds overhead, and or you can already interpolate that if you're in the fog, that also roughly translate that you're overcast as well, even though you might not be able to see that layer. Now, if we are going to expect mostly in the clear or anything up to in the clear, that's where we're going to be listing these 5 different categories. Now, the way to think of them is breaking the sky up into octas. And if it means 8 octas, that means you have complete coverage of the sky or overcast or cloudy conditions. And as you start clearing out, you start seeing less clouds, and that 3 to 5 eighths of the sky is partly cloudy and or partly sunny. Now, the only difference between those two is time of day. There used to be a different meaning back in the 90s and early aughts, but that's been consolidated into one single meaning. So partly sunny is typically used during the day. Partly cloudy is typically used during the overnight hours, but they're interchangeable. So if you see the two, that's what they mean nowadays. Mostly clear would mean you might have a few traces of clouds in the sky, some mare's tails, and clear skies would mean you have no clouds whatsoever, which is fairly rare for our location because we have a visibility or viewing horizon of about 100 plus miles on any particular clear day. And to have perfectly clear skies all the way around you for the entire day is kind of a rarity. And lastly, you can kind of see an example of all those elements put together. So on that Friday, it was in the clear under partly sunny skies, and that's how it would be worded. Now, as I was mentioning, we break our forecast into 12-hour blocks. So if it's going to be an event that's going to be occurring during a specific time, we're not going to lay out that, fog is going to clear at 3 p.m. because rarely is weather going to be on a set schedule like that. However, we might narrow the window down into 6-hour or 12-hour blocks, or even that 3-hour window to kind of even outline things a little bit more. So basically, if you start to see these 3 different languages, early, midday, or midnight, and late, it's breaking those into 6-hour elements. Now, if you wanted to get a little bit more focused while we're focusing on the forecast, we might break it down into in the morning, afternoon, before or after sunrise or sunset, after midnight, kind of putting a little bit more specificity on the timing of the event. But very rarely are we ever going to put a specific at this particular hour things are going to clear. But you might see a combination of those. So early morning would be the first 3 hours, and early afternoon might be the first 3 hours of that 6-hour afternoon block. So I know it kind of seems confusing, but you can always rewatch this and kind of get a little bit better layout on the terminology as for timing. Other descriptors we might use is above or over cloudy skies. So we do see undercast conditions. Very rarely will we put those in the forecast language, but if it's going to carry over from what we're already seeing, we might put that in. Or if we know with pretty good confidence that we're going to see undercast conditions, we'll put those in. Or if we're going to be trending towards in the clear or into the clouds, that is another common terminology that we use, which would mean that the summits are starting in the clear but trending into the clouds. And we want to make sure people are noting that. That way they're prepared that, it's not going to be mostly in the clear. It might just be clear for most of the day, but we're trending into the clouds towards the end of the day. So it kind of defines things a little bit better. Now, precipitation, this can also be carried into thunderstorms as well, is broken into 4 different categories here. So a slight chance, chance, likely, and then 100% certainty. Now, the way to kind of think of these is putting these into a grouping of 100 days. So if we had 100 days with the same exact scenario, anywhere from 1% to 30 of those particular 100 days are going to see rain events, or let's say likely 60 or upwards of 80 of those 100 days are going to see rain events. So it's kind of to give you an idea that in the past, it's led to this, and it will likely or probably or might lead to those other kind of explanations or events of rain and or thunderstorms. So That's kind of a way to look at them. On any particular area, you always have to also remember too that just because your trail was dry during the entire hiking event you might have been in, doesn't mean the next ridge over might not be experiencing rain showers. So that's another thing to kind of consider as well, that if there is a slight chance you might not have experienced it, but elsewhere in the state and or White Mountains may experience it. So it's not something to just kind of write off. It's just something to bear in mind, and pack a raincoat or something to prepare for, just in case one of those days do occur. Now, the precipitation types that we usually will list is rain, drizzle, freezing drizzle, hail, snow, sleet, and a wintry mix. So a wintry mix is kind of like the kitchen sink. It has everything going on. So you have rain, snow, you might see sleet in there, might see freezing rain. And if it's going to be more dominant towards something, we'll say trending towards that dominant thing. But if it's just going to be a sloppy, messy mix for all elevations, or at least those 5,000 footers and higher, that's where we're going to be putting a wintry mix. And usually we'll define that a little bit more in the synoptic forecast discussion to kind of outline what to expect. So if we're seeing more freezing rain than we're seeing snow, we'll outline it there. We might even also mention the freezing line, so people are aware that the freezing line will be dropping down in elevation, so people know that they might need some added traction later in the day. Now, as far as temperatures go, we kind of break them down into 5 different like spectrums. And in this particular example, I'm using teens just to kind of give an idea of what the verbiage would look like, rather than just putting dots. So if we're putting around a specific temperature, it's usually plus or minus 2 degrees around that particular temperature. If it's going to be a wide spectrum of temperatures over the course of the day, we might just say in this particular example, in the teens. However, we very rarely will put a 10-degree spread or whatever in the forecast. We'll usually narrow it down into more specifics and saying starting at or falling to or rising to. You can mostly assume that if we're not putting that rising or falling temperature, that the warm temperatures are going to be rising during the day and during the night falling. But the White Mountains, particularly, don't always follow the nocturnal and diurnal heat and cooling cycles. They're more driven by frontal passages and low and high pressure systems. So there might be chances where our warmest temperature is at midnight and our coldest temperature is at noon. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to pay particular attention to how the temperatures might be fluctuating while you're out on the trail, because they might not always do what you think they should be doing. Or if you see a automated forecast and think, well, it's going to be in the upper teens in the end of the day, but in reality, it might be falling to around zero by the end of the day. So it's important to notice how temperatures are trending up or down on any particular day. So just something to bear in mind. Now, winds are another thing that are important to the White Mountains because we do see fairly windy conditions. So from October to May, we typically see every other day with a hurricane force winds. So those are winds exceeding 73 miles per hour. And a quarter of every day in those months as well, we'll see a gust of 100 miles per hour. So it can be fairly windy in the winter, fall, and spring months. So it's always important to know wind speeds, not only but wind speeds, but wind directions. So wind directions are typically using an 8-point compass starting in the north and then working around in a 8-point compass. Now, our speeds are listed in miles per hour, and if you need to know what that is, you can convert into knots or kilometers per hour or whatever you are familiar with. But if you're ever reading our forecast, it will usually list them in 5 miles per hour or 10 miles per hour, and you can kind of convert those electronically nowadays. Now, for light and variable, that means winds are going to be less than 5 miles per hour and likely changing directions fairly rapidly. But in those kind of conditions, that's kind of those slight breezes that you might feel. Now, for winds that are going from 5 to 50 miles per hour, that's when we start putting a spectrum of 15-mile-per-hour blocks. So we might say 5 to 20 miles per hour, 15 to 30, or 45 to 60 miles per hour, and kind of breaking them out into a range of winds that you'll be experiencing. Now, these are sustained winds, not gusty winds. So just to know that if you're seeing 25 to 40 miles per hour, that means winds are going to be averaging that, not gusting to that. And for winds that are going from 50 to 100 miles per hour, that's when we start widening the gap to about 20 miles per hour. And if winds are going to be sustained exceeding 100 miles per hour, we typically try and stay within that 20-mile-per-hour window, but we might have to go a little bit further to kind of increment it a little bit higher because it could be fairly stronger winds. But once you reach 100 miles per hour, the difference between 100 and 130, if you're still able to stay on your feet, more power to you. Now, with winds, we're going to be trending with rough timing as well. So typically in our forecast models or in our forecast discussions or synoptics or those 12-hour brackets, we're going to be listing how winds are going to be increasing, decreasing over the course of the day. Because there are plenty of times where winds might be starting off low and then increasing over the course of the day and becoming increasingly windy towards the afternoon. Or it could be the opposite direction where you have some really windy conditions in the morning and then decreasing over the course of the day to the afternoon. Now, if those differences are going to be sizable, that's when we're going to break it out into three different chunks. So that early, midday, and late time frame, because you don't want to say, winds starting at 5 to 20 miles per hour, ending the day 100 to 130 miles per hour. Well, is it ramping up quickly or is it going slowly and steadily? And by breaking it into those three different type of scenarios or timing frames, that kind of allows people to know, okay, well, it's starting low. By the midday hours, it's going to be a little bit higher. And then by the afternoon, it's going to be ripping and roaring up there to kind of give people an idea of how fast things might be accelerating or decelerating depending on the day. Now, gusts are added to the forecasting language, so you might see 25 to 40 miles per hour, gusting up to 65 miles per hour. We're listing those up to the highest that we are determining via the models that we're looking at. So if you see that gusting 2, that means the 45 to 60 is the average winds, and the gusts are going to exceed that average and gust up to a particular point. Now, if it's going to be within the range where those gusts are occurring, you might just see winds 45 to 60. So that means the average as well as the gust are going to be contained within that 45 to 60 mile per hour range as an example. Now for wind chills, this is what temperatures feel like on exposed skin. So we only report them if they're going to be dropping below 32 degrees. Now this is a perceived feeling on the skin. This isn't an actual measured thing. And there's a lot of debate on the importance of wind chills, but for us, we always want to list them. That way people are aware whether or not they need to pack different types of layers to kind of prevent themselves from getting into trouble with hypothermia or frostbite, because the colder these conditions become, the more extreme you might be feeling and the higher risks you might be seeing. So as we're listing those wind chills below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, we're putting them in 10-degree spreads. So on the bottom of the page here, you can see 10 to 20 degrees is how we would list it if it were 10 to 20 degrees above zero on that particular day. If we're going to see temperatures falling and winds rising up, that's where we might say wind chills starting at a certain range, falling through the day to another certain range, or if they're going to be improving over the course of the day, we might say starting at a particular range and going up to a particular range. Now, for the higher terrain, we issue advisories and warnings for wind chills. And for a wind chill advisory, that means wind chills are going to be dropping to 30 below to 50 below. And if it's warning, it means that they're going to be exceeding 50 below. Now, this isn't universally the same or even nationally the same. It actually varies for locations. So for instance, Boston lists their wind chill advisory for 15 below to 24 below and wind chill warnings for 25 below or lower over a 3-hour span where they might be experiencing those wind chills. For Gray, Maine and Burlington, for instance, their advisory criteria is 20 below to 29 below, and their warning criteria is 30 below. And for Caribou, Maine, their range for advisory goes from 20 below to 34 below, and their warning criteria is anything lower than 35 below. So it kind of varies. The reason why we use 30 to 50 as well as 50 below, this is more commonly used for higher terrain out west. And so we're kind of using the same criteria that they're using for, because if we use the surrounding National Weather Service criteria, we'd be issuing wind chill advisories and warnings pretty much all winter long. So we kind of want to narrow the window down a little bit. So that way it's more driving home the reason why these are being issued or not. Now for snowfall amounts, if we're having those over the 12-hour period, we'll typically list those after the precip amounts or precip types that we're expecting. And we typically put those in 2-inch increments. So you might see trace to 2 inches or 2 to 4 inches or 6 to 8 inches. However, if it only looks like we're going to be seeing a chance of precipitation, we'll append the word possible to just list that it's not for sure, but this is possibly how much precip you might be seeing as far as snowfall goes. Now, for ice, we typically will also only report those if a freezing type precip is expected over that 12-hour period. And this is only listed when we're expecting it from freezing rain, not when we're expecting it from freezing fog. So if we're expecting it from freezing rain, or freezing drizzle in that case, that we might outline that a little bit further, saying specifically freezing rain in the forecasting language, so people are aware that the freezing fog could also create glaze, but it won't be in the particular amount that we're listing. Now, we typically only list this in a few tenths of an inch, but we might say anywhere from a trace to an inch. Now, that would be a little bit excessive, but it can occur in the higher terrain, especially if you get those temperatures hovering right around freezing, especially during the shoulder mounts. Now, other considerations to consider: as you double the wind speed, you quadruple the force. Winds rarely decrease as you go up in elevation. So if you're starting off where it's windy, it's not going to get any better as you go upward. Now, knowing the way the winds are going to be blowing is important, because leeward versus windward side plays a huge difference. And knowing if your trail is going to be mostly exposed above tree line or below tree line can also play a difference, because trees kind of act like a comb or a filtering device to kind of lower the wind speeds a little bit, so you're not getting the full brunt of the winds. Additionally, temperature also decreases with elevation. It rarely will increase. However, it can sometimes if you have an inversion. But the rough rule of thumb is, if you're going up in elevation, temperatures decrease by 4 degrees for every 1,000 feet. Now, that can also vary. The low end would be 3 degrees for every 1,000 feet. And on the extreme end, we've actually seen it as much as 7 or even 10 degrees for every 1,000 feet. But the main key here is you can take those temperatures and decrease them. So if all you have is a valley forecast, you can do the math and work out how much you're going to see from the change of the valleys, which are about 500 feet around here, up to 6288, and kind of give a rough idea as to how much temperatures are going to decrease. Or if you're taking our forecast, you can add the forecast numbers that you need to get down to the elevation that you might be going with. Now, again, the summit is in the fog over 60% of the year. So on any particular day, it's going to be foggy more than it's going to be clear. So that's also something to kind of bear in mind when you're forecasting. And any forecast is better than no forecast. So whether it's our forecast or somebody else's, the more information you have, the more better off you are. And luckily, within this region, there are a lot of forecasts to pull from. So the National Weather Service puts out a recreational forecast, which is listed here, or you can just type in NWS recreational forecast or look for it on their page. But this will give you another forecast area that goes out to about 36 hours. And that can kind of be used in conjunction with ours to kind of get an idea. You can also use any smartphone or websites that you might be familiar with. Just bear in mind that with smartphone apps and websites, they tend to put a smoothing effect on the forecast, and the numbers might be higher or lower. So the more information you have, the better. So what I normally tell people is Mount Washington is going to be the worst case scenario you might be running into. NWS might be the best case scenario, and your automated forecast might be the fantasy forecast that you might be going into. And then lastly, if you are familiar with forecasting models, they're abundant and free for people to look at online. So you can start learning what we're seeing and translating that into the models that you might be seeing. So these are some that we utilize up on the summit, but there's plenty out there if you just do a quick web search. But with that, we'll start putting all of this into a scenario. We'll pull Ty back in and get some discussion as to a real world scenario where these might be playing out.
Thanks very much, Ryan. And I'm just going to share my screen here. That was really helpful. So again, just to review, we went through what our goals are: human factors, physical factors. Ryan talked a lot about the environmental factors. And now we're going to, as Ryan mentioned, we're going to integrate a scenario into this. So we've chosen the September ascent of Mount Washington and to summit via the Lionhead Trail. And so when we talk about assigning a value and discussing it, I think it's really important if you're going solo, you know, there's some self-reflection there, some self-assessment. If you're going with a group, it really behooves the group to have an open discussion about what that goal is, particularly in relation to what the weather's going to be, and what the capabilities are of the team. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. So if I put a low value on the summit of Mount Washington, what that might sound like is, I'm just happy to get outdoors. I'm psyched to get out on a trail. If I don't get the summit, it really, for me, it's just about being out here today in the wilderness, getting away from work or whatever is going on. A medium value to this might be, hey, I'm going to go to Treeline and check it out, see what the weather's doing, think about how what the forecast is, project out how am I feeling. Maybe I'm going to take a run up to the summit, maybe I won't. If I place a high value on that summit, I'm potentially setting myself up. If I'm all in on this, I'm potentially setting myself up that I will make decisions in order to avoid losing the summit. And so every decision that I make, every action is going to be in an effort to avoid the loss. Okay. And this is, again, approaching this from a risk management kind of gambling perspective. And so I want you to think about this, particularly if you have a goal of doing the 48, whether it's in the Four Seasons or the Winter 48, when you're really relying on that calendar, you have a schedule to do the peaks. And even if it's outside of the 48 goal, how locked in are you to this day out? And asking yourself, am I so fixated on getting that summit that I'm going to just ignore or marginalize all of these indicators that are going on and this information that's available to me in an effort to achieve, standing on the top of Mount Washington? So what we're going to do now is, Ryan, we're going to take a look at a Higher Summits forecast, for that autumn climb in relation to what we're hoping to do. And Ryan is now going to walk us through his interpretation of what he sees in relation to the itinerary that we've set for ourselves. Ryan?
Yeah, so for this particular day, it was about mid-September, and the main key here, so as I was mentioning, is temperatures decrease with elevation and winds increase with elevation. And so it's important to look both at the valleys where you're going to be starting and the summits where you're going to be ending, because in the September months, or shoulder seasons, there can be quite a difference between valley versus summits. So for this particular day, you would be starting off in the valleys where temperatures are in the 50s during the day, and going up to an elevation where you're expecting mid 20s. So quite a big difference between valley and summit, where you might be starting off where wearing shorts and a t-shirt might feel fine, but by the time you get to the summit, you're really seeing those cold temperatures. And not only that, but you're also seeing high winds from the north and northwest here, and staying fairly stiff throughout the day. So 35 to 50, decreasing to 25 to 40. So on bare skin, it might actually feel like it's below 0 degrees on parts of the day, and maybe only raising up into the single or teens as you're going through the afternoon. And then the next day it improves a little bit, but again, you're going back to only around 30 degrees, so still below freezing, with a pretty stiff wind making it feel well below that. So even though you are clear and it might look like a great day from the valley, nice and sunny, warm or mild temperatures with very little wind, you're going to be encountering fall or almost winter-like conditions up on the summits. And that, bear in mind that if there was precipitation, you might be encountering ice on the trails down to a certain elevation, and not just clear, rough, dry rocks that you might be wanting to experience. So it's always good to not only look at the summits but also the valleys, to kind of get an idea of what you're leaving from, going up to, and returning to in the afternoon.
And if we look at some topography here, this is our route up Lion Head from Pinkham Notch Visitor Center, the summit of Mount Washington, the surrounding peaks. You'll see this is kind of the direction of what a northwest and westerly wind would look like. This is points north. And we know based on the forecast that winds are primarily going to be from the north. Ryan, can you talk about the dynamics of wind direction in regard to this route that we've set for our itinerary today?
Yeah, so for this particular event, you can see when the winds are from the northwest, you almost kind of have a blocking type setup, where you have Mount Jefferson, Mount Clay, Mount Washington itself kind of, protecting you on the leeward side of the mountain. But as those winds shift more northerly, you become a little bit more exposed. Mount Adams is kind of there to kind of provide a little bit of shelter. But for the most part, as soon as you start breaking above tree line, right around Lionhead, you might actually be feeling a little bit more of that wind that's going to be hitting you from, the right side as you're heading up and the left side as you're heading down. So you might lose that sheltering effect that those northwesterly winds might allow you to have, especially if the winds are shifting to the north as they're expected. On the flip side, if they're starting from the north and shifting to the northwest, you might be less exposed or more exposed, depending on the time of day that you're going to be experiencing those shifts in wind, basically.
And Ryan, could you, that's really helpful. Can we shift locations over to the west a bit to Franconia Ridge and talk about what this wind dynamic would mean for a hiker in that area?
Sure. So if we had this particular scenario over, let's say you're doing Mount Lafayette, as you're going up Mount Lafayette, if the winds are from the northwest, you might get a little bit of clipping from the, Cannon and Kinsman, some of the ranges that are west of you. You might be a little bit sheltered there, but as soon as you start breaking above tree line, if that wind starts to shift more towards the north, those mountain ranges are more oriented to that north-south orientation. So you could be exposed to the wind for most of your day as you're starting to break tree line. And if you're doing the entire ridge line, you might either be facing into or with your wind to the back, depending on which direction you're going. So it's always kind of important to know where the wind direction is, not only the wind speed, but also that direction, because that can also play a huge role on whether or not you're going to be on the leeward side or the windward side and having to fight those winds or battle those winds as you're going up or down or across the ridge line.
And as you mentioned, Ryan, it's not only important to think about that on your ascent, but also how the winds impact us on the descent as well.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
up is only half the journey, down is part of the other journey that you have to take. So always kind of know how things might be changing on your up versus your down.
Great. Thank you. All right. So we have our goal. We've talked about, we've potentially assigned a value to it. Ryan has given his observations on the dynamics of weather. And now let's touch on some human and physical factors here. And as I mentioned, again, some of the pitfalls that we can have around decision making when we're undertaking a goal or doing something that has some degree of risk to it, or something that we very much want to do or accomplish. There's a couple of different things. One is the planning fallacy. And what the planning fallacy is when I'm putting my plan or itinerary together, I can be kind of lured into this situation where I'm putting it together in the most positive light possible. So my interpretation of the weather, my interpretation of what I'm reading out of a guidebook or what I've read online, I'm approaching it in the most positive way. And what ends up happening is we can underestimate the amount of time it's actually going to take us to accomplish something. We can also underestimate the complexity of that route and the risks associated with it. At the same time, looking at self and group, I can overestimate, again, I'm looking at this in as positive a way as possible. I can overestimate my ability or performance, my level of experience, and I can overestimate the experience level and the performance of either the person that I'm with or if I'm part of a larger group. Because if you think back on a recent plan that you had, whether it was in the mountains or at work or what have you, just ask yourself, did I accomplish that plan? Did it go according to plan? And did I accomplish it in the amount of time that I assumed it was going to take? And generally, what we're not factoring in are complications, interruptions, a piece of equipment breaking, either our own or somebody else's. There's a whole lot of factors that go into an itinerary beyond just what I'm reading online as to how long it's going to take me to complete that route. Familiarity heuristic, again, if I'm very accustomed to being up in the White Mountains and I've done this summit numerous times, what we can find ourselves doing is we're so familiar with it, we're kind of on autopilot. Think about your commute to work and how you just end up at the workplace and you don't really remember how you got there. Same can hold true in an alpine environment where I've done this before, and so I'm not really paying attention to what's going on around me or what might be different this time. Again, I'm lacking situational awareness. confirmation bias. Again, I'm looking at the information that is most favorable to my plan. And so I might pull a couple of sentences out of Ryan's Higher Summit forecast that support what I want to do. And I'm marginalizing or ignoring that information that might tell me that today is not the day, or that it might just be a tree line day, or I'm not going out altogether. Expert halo, when I'm with a group of people and I perceive a higher level of experience or expertise or tenure or power or authority within the group, and if we're making our ascent of Lionhead and I see things are starting to go wrong, we're way behind schedule, didn't bring headlamps, running out of water, I'm not voicing concern because I'm afraid that I'm going to be criticized within my own group, isolated, marginalized, or just removed from it and never invited to go with them again, which, if that's the feeling that you have, that might not be the group to be with in the first place. And then sunk cost effect. Lastly, I'm escalating my commitment toward that summit because of the time, energy, and money that I've put into it. I've got a long holiday weekend. I want to do the traverse of the presidentials, or I want to summit Mount Washington or Lafayette. The weather doesn't look good. The forecast is telling me today's not the day, but I'm up here for the weekend. I've got a plan, and it's unlikely that I'm going to be able to come back this fall, spring, summer, or winter to do this again. And I'm just going to continue to push because of the fact that I'm on a schedule and I've invested so much to be here already. And then lastly, I just ruined that. The physical factors, we talk about the 10 essentials. You can find those on the Hike Safe website. Those are very, very important. Also, if you think about from a search and rescue perspective, I want you to think about, if you look at your itinerary and the furthest point possible away from it, what does that mean if I find myself incapacitated and unable to continue? Am I able to take care of myself until search and rescue can get to me? It takes a long time for search and rescue assets to get to us in the backcountry. Do I have the gear that's appropriate for the weather that I may encounter over the course of the day if I can't go any further? Okay, and so think about that, not only the 10 essentials, but beyond that. And when you look at the Higher Summits forecast, what's that all going to mean? Behind this right here, it says fluid and food protection. As Ryan mentioned, we're going to be looking at that forecast and we see freezing temperatures, the potential for frost. Am I insulating my food? Am I bringing food that won't freeze? Are my fluids protected as well so that I continue to hydrate and focus on self-care? I may need traction devices, as Ryan said. I'm going to absolutely need additional layers because the higher I go, we know, based on Ryan's assessment and expertise, the colder it's going to get, and do I have the requisite gear to be there? And then lastly, we talk about the 10 essentials. I really believe there's an 11th essential to be added to that list, and that's self-awareness. Knowing who you are, knowing what your experience level is and your capability in relation to what we are setting out to do. Yes, it's good to get outside of our comfort zone. I think some degree of risk-taking is important. That's where we grow. That's where we develop experience and technical competency. But it's really having an honest conversation with ourselves, a real self-assessment to say, you know, is my ability in line with the objective that I've set out for myself on any given day, factoring in weather, factoring in terrain, and the equipment that I have available to me. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Brian.
Well, thank you so much, Ty. Thank you so much, Ryan, for both sharing some of your expertise. Obviously, we're just scratching the surface here on a number of topics, and I'd encourage folks, now's a great time. We have lots of questions, excellent questions that we'll try and get to as many as possible here. For those of you, again, if you're using Zoom, if you're connecting through Zoom, use the Q&A button. You can find it right at the bottom of your toolbar there, and we'll get to as many questions as we can get to tonight. For anything we can't get to, feel free to email us directly at education@mountwashington.org. But Ty, actually, I mean, this is a question I guess I have for you that no one's asked just yet. But I mean, so obviously you've spoken about some specific example here, kind of laying out all these different factors. But you've also spent a lot of time personally, professionally, analyzing some very specific cases where things have obviously and unfortunately gone wrong. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to some specific examples of some of the things you're just talking about, and whether it's the physical factors, the environmental factors, where some of these things have gone wrong, I guess briefly, and some of the things that you've been writing about these past several years now.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think if we look at accidents in the mountains, in the White Mountains, and trouble, it generally doesn't come down to one factor or one single event. There's a local writer, Michael Weigert, and I'm probably pronouncing his last name incorrectly, but he describes it as a series of inconsequential events that go unnoticed by the participant. And we can see examples of people going out, maybe not necessarily having the requisite experience or local knowledge of the risks associated with the White Mountains, the unpredictability, the unforgiving terrain. But it's just so accessible to us because we can see it from so far away, throughout the state as we're coming up the interstate, and wow, that mountain looks so close. And so I think it comes down to experience level, preparation, underestimating the forecast, or not even not accessing the forecast at the higher summits level. And then it's just a series of decisions that keep us headed up the mountain, and those stack on, as Michael aptly describes, until one thing goes wrong, and then there's a cascade of issues that we have to manage.
Yeah, and certainly for any of those folks out there who've read any of Ty's work before, he details that very specifically, and just how small some of these issues might seem at in the face of it, I guess, when they originally come up, but they really do seem to accumulate in certain scenarios. So I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit, because we've been getting lots of fantastic questions and curiosity about what Ryan presented on. Lots of folks who engage, obviously, with the higher summits forecast out there, and a lot of questions, both technical and otherwise. One from Ronald Smith, who asks around the modeling side of things, do you use a high resolution, in this case asking like a 1 kilometer grid resolution forecast model that resolves mountain shape and surface properties? I figure this is a good one for you, Ryan.
We definitely look at them, but for the most part, we don't have any models that are running internally. So we're kind of at the bay, or whatever you want to say, at anybody that provides us the forecast to look at. That's not to say that we don't have the availability. We do look at the HRRR forecast model, but for the most part, in my experience looking at those particular models, they tend to overdo things a little bit much. I don't think they've been able to resolve that, because I think they're so fresh or so new to the game, that I think for the most part, at least when it comes to winds, those high resolution models so far are over projecting. And in addition to that, they don't go out the full 48 hours that we might need them, at least on the websites that are free to the public. So they're good to reference, to at least see what they are stating in relation to the various other models. But it's not one that I would just adherently stick to just that one particular model. And that's why it's important to look at everything and kind of assess as a human what I think the forecast is going to be. And experience definitely plays into that as well, because we might be seeing a scenario that occurred a few years earlier that we know, based on that experience, the winds might have been higher or lower than the forecast models we're discussing. So it's kind of important to not just focus on one particular model. I know a lot of people like to focus on the Euro model versus the GFS model, but there are tons of models out there. It's just, for some reason, that's the two models everybody likes to focus on, because they typically have the best results, but they're far from the only two that are available to us when we are forecasting.
Yeah, that's
Brian,
great.
I'm just curious why I didn't get that question.
Oh, Ty, by all means, go for it.
Okay, yeah, right.
Ryan, kind of a follow-up here, one that I definitely don't know the answer to. Maybe you do, but does the Higher Summits Outlook ever update at off hours, not at 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. if projected weather changes significantly? And that's a question from Mary, and that's a good one. Can you recall a time in which an update was made to a forecast outside of those original hours?
We've done it a few times. In particular, if we see a significantly strong wind event or a significantly strong cold windy event kind of thing where we might need to up the numbers. However, we very rarely do that. And the main reason why is if you're already on the trail, most of the White Mountains do not have cell service, contrary to people's belief. So it's one of those things where if you're already on the trail, even if we update it, all you're going to have is that morning or afternoon forecast. Now, as I did state in my presentation, we do sometimes put the forecast out earlier than that 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. window. So it might look like we're updating the forecast a little bit earlier or more frequently, but we typically try to stick to those two 12-hour blocks. And for the most part, things rarely change that drastically over a 12-hour period where we need to start putting out more forecasts, at least for our forecast page. Now, if you're looking at other people's forecast page, we don't provide any other forecast information. So if you're looking at another website other than mountwashington.org, we have zero involvement in that. So just be aware whatever they're putting out is their own thing and not related to us.
Yeah, good to know, certainly, and thanks for filling in a little bit that history. Certainly a rare situation when that does happen, but obviously things do change. Ty, a question from you from Chris talking a little bit about decision making here. Chris asks, when you determine you are unable to continue upward and stuck in very difficult weather, how do you determine whether you try to shelter in place versus descending? Thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chris. I think what it's going to come down to is, you know, where are you and do you know how to get back? Do you have the navigation tools or the navigation skills to do so? If you do and again, I think these are real-time decisions that have to be made. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think the big question you also have to ask is if I'm not going to move, am I going to be able to maintain warmth and shelter myself appropriately until I can either, at that point, essentially self-rescue or be rescued. Again, these are really individual, but I think, you know, in talking with a lot of mountain experts and search and rescue experts, you know, they would tell you if you can get back the way or you know where you are and you're familiar and you're able to do so, that's movement is good.
Yeah, I guess the best odds you have. Couple questions, in fact, a few probably on the same theme, and uh, Ryan, don't take this personally, but there's some questions here about accuracy of forecasting. People are truly curious. I think there's an understanding here of how difficult and complex, obviously, forecasting the atmosphere and surface interactions and all that. But um, Ben asks, how often is the higher summits forecast inaccurate off the mark? Keith asks sort of a similar question, but also adds, so, what is that metric for how you kind of, measure how far off you are? And even more, a little more specifically, what is the weather feature, what variable, wind speed, direction, temperature, precip, that you most often sort of misforecast, as Keith is asking here?
Yeah. So we've had a few interns look at our forecasting accuracy over the years, at least three interns that I can remember in my time span here. And in all three results, they tend to find that our forecasts, for the most part, tend to be around the 70th percentile correct. That doesn't mean that we're nailing it every single time, but overall, that's what we're doing. Our most accurate forecast tends to be the first 12-hour and 24-hour forecast window, and then it gets a little bit worse as you go out in time, and that's true about any forecast, no matter if you're doing higher summits versus the valley. The way that we kind of do the judging of those or determination of whether or not we've missed the mark or not is typically when the interns are assessing it, they put a point value. So if we're spot on, we get 0 points. If we get, above, we might get 1 point, or if we're below, we might get 1 point. And depending on how far those ranges are within the thresholds, and then kind of doing a point-based scoring system to kind of get an idea of how far off the mark we are. Now, as far as the most inaccurate-ish thing that we forecast, that tends to be fog. because it can be a very hard thing to determine, especially if the inversion's set up. We might get a case scenario kind of like your background where, we have undercast conditions, but 99% of the mountains are still in the fog. So for us, we're in the clear, but we forecast it in the fog. Or it might be just the opposite, where we're literally the only cloud in the entire state. Everyone else is in the clear, but we forecast it in the fog. So it can be kind of hard to judge, mainly the fog on the summits more than anything, because it's a very narrow window at times as to what can cause that fog to be on, above, or below us, basically.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ryan. That's fascinating. Um, Back to you, Ty. Your question, more of a statement that I'd love for you to respond to from Jeff Morris, who asked, or basically says, my 11th essential has become summiting is optional, getting down safe is mandatory. How common do you think that perspective is, or how frequent are you coming across that sort of perspective? That seems pretty healthy.
Yeah, thank you for the statement. And yeah, it's a great 11th essential. And I think by and large, the hiking community in particular they just do a really good job. If you look at the number of people that go into the mountains every year in relation to the number of accidents there are, it's a low percentage of accidents, and the need for rescue. It's just that when we read about them, and they're so prominent, whether it's online or on the news or in the newspaper, that we can have that perception that it's happening all the time. Um, so I think, again, I think most people know where that line is. I talk to a lot of people that hike, and they repeated exactly what he just said in terms of the summit's optional, getting back to your vehicle is not.
And
And
maybe
Ryan, if
someday.
you have any perspective, jump in.
No, I think that's spot on. We always want to remind people that it's the journey, not the destination, when it comes to hiking in the White Mountains. So even if it's just breaking tree line to feel what a high wind event feels like, nothing says you have to continue on to get to that destination. And I think you kind of touched upon it earlier, where people have deceived notions that the mountains are just really close by because we can see so many of them from neighboring areas. And I kind of call that the passenger mirror effect, where objects appear closer than they actually are. So that's something to just kind of bear in mind, that even though the summit looks like it's right there, it can still be a significant part of time before you reach that summit. So do your assessments as you outlined to know whether or not you have that time and availability to continue on in the adverse conditions you might be affecting or getting affected by.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Brian, was talking with the team leader of the Fish and Game Advanced Search and Rescue team a few weeks ago, and in relation to call volume this year compared to last year, because I think, again, there's a perception a lot of people are going into the backcountry because of the pandemic. And he said in terms of mission volume, in terms of actual call out, it's right on par with the year before. What they are seeing a pretty significant increase in are the non-call outs, where you have a fish and game officer that's on the phone with a hiker who's out after dark or is off trail, doesn't really know where they are. The cell company is pinging their phone to get a GPS coordinate, and this fish and game officers in the middle of the night are at their kitchen table with a computer trying to walk hikers to the trail to get them reacclimated to the trail so they can get down. So that's happening a lot more, and doesn't
Yeah,
get
I've heard,
reported generally.
I've read a little bit about that. I was curious if that's sort of a newer, slightly more common thing that's happening. That, I mean, obviously the amount of resources and time required to safely get folks help in the mountains is significant, so much so that it requires massive volunteer forces to make that stuff happen. But that's so a little bit newer, a little bit more common, I guess.
Yeah, and I think they're seeing I think it was a 50 or 60% increase over last year of that type of call, where they're dealing with it over the phone generally and through a laptop computer.
Interesting.
Mm.
Very interesting. Question here. Again, lots of questions about the forecast, which is wonderful. I think we'll have to do another program specifically just on the forecast alone. But a question from Angela, who asks a common question we get that I understand why this can be confusing, but Angela asks why avalanche warnings are not included in the forecast. What do you say about that, Ryan?
So yeah, so the avalanche determination, warnings, advisories, and so on and so forth are issued by the Mount Washington Avalanche Center, which is operated by the United States Forest Service, and they are their own separate entity. That being said, if one is issued, so more recently, National Weather Service now gets reports from the U.S. Forest Service. And if that timing lies within when we are doing a forecast, we will share avalanche warnings if they are issued by the U.S. Forest Service. However, in our synoptic discussion, as well as a blurb that we're adding to the top of the page, we are still directing people to the U.S. Forest Service. So that is a completely separate science and a completely separate analysis that none of us are trained to do. And so we don't want to put any of our 2 cents into there. And that's why if you are looking for avalanche information, we will put the warnings up, but for the most detailed and accurate information, you should be checking out the Mount Washington Avalanche Center's forecast to figure out what their analysis of the avalanche forecasting is down in the polls below.
Right.
And I would encourage people to go to that site and read the accident analysis. Often it's written by Frank Karras, and he does an exceptional analysis. I really admire his work, and I think it's a really educational read for anybody, whether you're heading into avalanche terrain or not.
Yeah, certainly, and one that I'm glad, Ryan, you mentioned that we've made sure to link to that resource as well from the Higher Summits forecast. A lot of different entities. We all are working together, including the Avalanche Center, certainly relying on the precipitation and wind data in particular, even temperature data in order to help create those forecasts. But confusing in that we're all sort of in this small little space, but certainly that's sort of the need for greater partnership and communication. So certainly make sure you're checking those sites out if you do intend to venture onto steep slopes. Um, Probably just have a time for just a few more questions here. I know we're going a little bit long, but that's a wonderful thing because we have a lot of great questions here. But I do want to get to just a few more. Specifically, and I mean, there are two sort of areas that I know we've talked about a little bit, especially Ryan, and talking about the different forecasts that are available out there. And then also onto that topic of, well, how do we translate some of these depending on where we are between, the valleys and whatever summit peak we're on. So, I mean, I guess the first question going back, here's one from Doug Teschner who says is making a suggestion actually around sort of interpolating and interpreting the higher summits forecast. He kind of suggests, well, maybe we should specify a little bit more clearly, that specifically the higher summits mean 5,000 feet and above tree line. It's really kind of data coming from Mount Washington. He's basically found on quite a few occasions that, he's going out and he's finding that the forecast sounds a lot worse than the conditions that he's finding and whatever the hikes it is that he's doing here. But I don't know if you can maybe talk, Ryan, a little bit more broadly about how you kind of, if you're setting out, whatever the certain peaks you're going at, you're looking at the higher summits forecast, how can you use that information to kind of translate to whatever peak maybe you're going to hike?
Yeah, yeah, it can be a little bit confusing and kind of like I touched on. Luckily, we live in a region where there are a lot of forecasts put out there. So we're not the only forecast. I'd like to say that we are, but there are plenty of others to kind of look at. And that's where getting a second or third opinion, whether or not it's National Weather Service or an automated app, none of them of which I can, you know, reliably say you should go check out this other forecast because every forecast has its bias. Some of them, the other problem that a lot of these automated forecasts run into is what's called grid spacing and grid smoothing. So models kind of put everything in a giant box. And if the average terrain feature of that box is 4,000 feet and we're one singular 6,000 foot peak, we get chopped down to 4,000 feet. So a lot of times what will happen is if you're looking at one of those automated forecast box, it might put us down further in elevation as well as further down south or other elements like that. And the numbers that you might be seeing in those automated forecasts might be warmer, calmer, sunnier, and so on and so forth. So it's important to look at ours and automatically, as I kind of stated, As you go up in elevation, winds are going to be higher and typically it's going to be colder. If you're going to a 4,000 footer, start doing the math to work backwards. So if we're saying temperatures are going to be 30 degrees, start adding that, 4 degree or whatever you want to do down to 4,000 feet. And that'll give you at least a rough idea as to temperatures, what you're going to be expecting. If your 4,000 footer is in the tree or in the tree line or below tree line, odds are you're not going to feel anything like we were forecasting. So you might, decrease those winds and maybe look at another forecasting website to see what they're forecasting. And that's kind of why I was saying if you at least get three opinions, you can kind of look at ours as the worst case scenario you might run into. You might look at NWS's as the best case scenario you might run into. And then if you get a third opinion that's kind of somewhere around those two, or maybe in between, or maybe skewed towards the other one, that'll give you kind of a third opinion. And if you're prepared for all three of those, you're going to be prepared for whatever you encounter. So it's always better to be over prepared than to be underprepared and be caught off guard. So if you're going up in the mountains and expecting it to be 45 to 60 miles per hour, and we're forecasting 100 miles per hour, there's a drastic difference between those two, especially how they feel. So if you're prepared for one and it ends up being under, you're great and all set. And you can blame the meteorologist. But if it ends up being higher than what you were expecting, that's where getting a third or a second opinion will be kind of important to kind of know what you're getting into ahead of time.
Thanks, Ryan. And I mean, I guess, we obviously been talking about all these different ways to help people understand information, interpret information, prepare for whatever their objective is. Lonnie asks, and apology if I'm mispronouncing your name, Lonnie. Um, all else fails, incidents we do know happen nonetheless. What do you do if you find yourself in trouble on the mountain, out in the backcountry? How do you put out a call for help? How do you help yourself? And Ty, I don't know if you could speak maybe a little more broadly to that and what sort of resources people can use there.
Yeah, I thank you, Lonnie. I think the first thing, again, Alpine experts would tell you is you find yourself in a situation and it's easier to say than do, but it's not to panic. It's take a breath, assess where you are. I think the most important thing is, you want to maintain your core temperature. You want to stay warm because that helps you make good decisions. Because the colder we get, the quicker decision making kind of goes out the window. There are different methods to call for help. If you are fortunate enough to be in an area with cell phone coverage, and I do think there is technology there that allows you to make your 911 call. You guys might be able to speak to that, where you have some cell technology on the summit. And then there are different kinds of rescue beacons. But I would say if you're relying solely on batteries and satellites, that's not the best contingency. Always good to have those map and compass and survival skills. There's a number of different organizations throughout the Mount Washington Valley and the White Mountains, like Solo and the AMC, EMS, IME, local guide services that offer this type of programming and expertise that can help you with that. But again, I think it's going back to the 10 essentials. They make very lightweight emergency blankets, lightweight shelters that, although they may not be optimal, it's something.
Yeah.
And again, hopefully, sorry, but itinerary. You've got to leave word of where you are with, I would recommend 2 separate parties, so that if the first person you left it with forgets you're out there, that you have a backup, you have a contingency.
Yeah, that's where I was gonna go, Ty, is
Thanks.
leave a pretty detailed note. Well, I might leave the last question actually again with you, Ty. There's still lots to get to, and apologies if we didn't get to your question tonight. But Ty, lots of people curious. What's the next story? What are you working on? What are you investigating? I don't know what you can speak to at this point.
Thank you. At this point, I'm just talking about, I'm talking about both books in different venues, and that's what I'm focused on, and doing things like this. Again, it's been such a pleasure to work with Ryan and you, and to be part of the Observatory's efforts tonight with Science in the Mountains. So no plans right now, and just having discussions with people about decision making and mountain safety.
All right, good to know. Good. I think I think that's saying you're not doing anything right now. I think that was a good non-answer, perhaps, but we'll take it nonetheless. Thanks, Ty. We appreciate that.
Yeah,
Well, all right,
I
folks.
struggle with it. So yeah,
Well, thanks everyone so much for joining tonight and tonight's free program. If you enjoyed it, if you've been enjoying the Science of the Mountains lecture series, we'd strongly encourage you to become a member of the Observatory if you're not one already, and also donate to help support programs like these that we try and keep low cost and free to the public. If you have thoughts about tonight's program or suggestions for future programs, please take some time to fill out our Google Forms survey, which should show up in your Zoom window following this program or in a follow-up thank you email from Zoom as well. That'll come out tomorrow. Certainly, we appreciate any of your thoughts there. Don't forget to join us for our next program on Tuesday, May 11th at 7 p.m. That's when meteorologist and horticulturalist David Epstein will join us to discuss our changing climate and horticultural impacts. So don't forget to register for those programs and watch any previous programs you may have missed. And that's over at mountwashington.org/SITM. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks again, Ryan. Thanks, Ty. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.
thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks, guys. Bye.